Hello, everyone, and welcome to PEMreads. I'm Blair Steck, Director of Inclusive Philanthropy here at PEM, and I'm so pleased that you all have joined us. With us today is Dr. Bernie Krause, the author of our book selection, The Power of Tranquility in a Very Noisy World. Dr. Bernie Krause began his professional career as a recording engineer and backup studio guitarist for early Motown sessions while attending the University of Michigan. After graduation, he joined the Weavers, filling the tenor position originally created by Pete Seeger, performing at Carnegie Hall with them in 1963. When the Weavers disbanded, Bernie and his late music partner, Paul Beaver, introduced the Moog synthesizer to pop music and film. Bernie's work is featured on many albums of that era, including those of the George Harrison, Mick Jagger, David Byrne and Brian Eno, Van Morrison, Peter Gabriel, The Byrds, and The Doors, not to mention Beaver and Krause's own albums. Bernie's contributions can be heard on over 135 major feature films like Apocalypse Now, Performance, Love Story, Castaway, and Rosemary's Baby. In 1981, having earned his doctorate in bioacoustics, Bernie began his second career as a founder of soundscape ecology, a new field of study focusing on marine and terrestrial soundscapes of remaining wild habitats. As a sound designer, Bernie's sound sculptures can be heard at major public venues like the California Academy of Sciences, the Smithsonian, the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and several London venues. He is the author of The Great Animal Orchestra, Finding the Origins of Music in the World's Wild Places, the history of how animals taught us to dance and sing. He is also a co-composer of Symphony, commissioned by the BBC, created with Oxford colleague Richard Blackford. Together, they have also composed Biophony, the ballet score commissioned by the Alonzo King Lines Ballet. A recent worldwide fine art exhibition of his work, the Great Animal Orchestra exhibit, was commissioned by the Fondation Cartier pour l'Art Contemporain in Paris and has been featured worldwide. His just published book, The Power of Tranquility in a Very Noisy World, is the subject of today's conversation. And without further ado, we're going to turn to a presentation that Bernie has put together for us. And after that, we will have our discussion section of the book. So I will look forward to seeing you very soon.
My name is Bernie Krause, and I'm a soundscape ecologist, a new field I help to introduce to the biological sciences and fine art. My new book, The Power of Tranquility in a Very Noisy World, brings into focus many aspects of noise not previously considered. For the past 50 years, I've been recording the sounds of living organisms, large and microscopic, marine and terrestrial. These biophonies, or the collective expressions emanating from wild habitats that remain, are key to a more complete understanding of natural world occurrences. Yet aside from climate change, resource extraction, and land transformation, one major problem we have to overcome when protecting these amazing wild habitats and their voices is the noise that we humans generate. Because we are intrinsically connected to every living organism, human noise affects wildlife in the same manner it affects us. The Power of Tranquility sheds new light on that challenge, an issue that touches every aspect of our lives. In the end, tranquility beats noise every time. And now, some observations on that subject. Recently, I was tasked to come up with a definition of the term noise, that elusive special class of turbulence that is separate and unique from all others in our life experience. In the process, I'll be illustrating how some of the noises we produce harm us and other organisms, and what the hell we can do about it individually and collectively. It turns out that I've just written a book about that very subject. The Power of Tranquility in a Very Noisy World covers all those points. Well, why does this matter? Well, it affects every aspect of our lives, whether it's religion, academics, culture, language, politics, music, communications, health, or just plain leisure activities, and a whole host of others. David Bowie once suggested that tomorrow belongs to those who can hear it coming. But you'll never be able to hear it coming if the signals are masked by noise. Hey, check it out. Even if the signals were clearly transmitted and received, begin by asking, who among us has the requisite set of ears to hear what's headed our way? A host of stuff lurking just over the horizon. Well, let's jump right in. On any given virus-normal summer weekend, racetracks such as Sonoma Raceway feature drag races and other events that delight 100,000 fans with extremely high levels of noise, and where the spill of each event's low-frequency rumble can be heard and recorded at our home 18 miles away. Ask any attendee at these gatherings why they come, and they'll tell you that they go for the illusion of power that the intense noise produces. In fact, if it weren't for the noise, these events would be unlikely to draw a fraction of those numbers. Speaking of noise and power, that reminds me of a comment made by James Watt, Ronald Reagan's Secretary of the Interior. Shortly after Watt defunded the U.S. Office of Noise Abatement in 1982, a federal bureau that had played an important role in the Environmental Protection Agency, the office was left with no resources to enforce its safe sound environment mandates. When asked his reason for targeting that group, Watt responded, "Noise is power, and the noisier we are as Americans, the more powerful we appear to be to others." Then there are the noises of war, and the despicable manner in which humans sometimes treat each other and members of other species, with consequences too severe to rehash here. But there's one small incident worth noting, because it amplifies Watt's distorted perspective of noise in America. In 2000, I attended a soundscape meeting at the U.S. Department of Interior and the National Park Service in Washington, D.C. The purpose of the meeting was to discuss how particular types of sound might impact wildlife. One biologist from the U.S. Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground described how cannon fire was being tested to see if it could successfully drive problematic birds away from the runways there. At the end of her presentation, the presenter was asked if the test was successful. "Not completely," she said, "but I love the sound of artillery. To me, it represents the sound of freedom." The room grew dead silent for a moment because no one knew quite what to say. Eager to break the ice, I raised my hand and asked, "But, Lieutenant, doesn't that depend on which side of the cannon you're standing?" Spoiler alert, for the airport employees in Gloucestershire, England, the landing site for the royal family near their country estates, that problem was solved in the late 90s by playing, are you ready for this, Tina Turner tracks. No kidding. It was a big deal in the late 90s. Google it. So what is noise? Acoustic noise is that part of the soundscape that is distracting, unwanted, and contains no useful contextual information. Either that, or the timbres and levels are just plain harmful, or even deadly to us as well as other critters within range of its signal. And yes, certain types of acoustic noise will kill you. More on this in a moment, but do keep in mind that not all noise is acoustic. And what, you may ask, is a soundscape? Soundscapes are all of the sounds that reach our ears from whatever source. Soundscapes are comprised of three basic sources. The first and oldest on Earth is the geophony. The term geophony is made up of the Greek prefix geo, meaning earth, and the Greek suffix phone meaning sound. So it includes all the non-biological natural sound produced by wind, water, and movement of the land. The whole concept goes back 4.5 billion years to the formation of the planet, a time signified by awesome textures of sound. Think of volcanic explosions, huge storms, earthquakes, avalanches, sounds of tidal waves, tornadoes, and fierce windstorms, those kinds of events. But there was nothing to hear geophonies until organisms evolved sometime between 750 and 500 million years ago. The sound that these organisms produce collectively and individually is referred to as the biophony. Bio meaning life, and phone again meaning sound, the sounds of living organisms. And finally, we get to human-generated sound, a separate category primarily because we've lost our essential connection to the natural world, and we now experience it through the limited ways in which we describe our place here. For example, there's nature, and then there's us. Anthropophony is the term for this third category. It's divided into two subclasses, controlled sound like music, language, and theater, and incoherent or chaotic sound, which I refer to as noise. In the human sense, the larger percentage of that subcategory is electromechanical, or technophonic, and it's from this category, a subclass of primarily human-generated signal, that sound becomes noise. The incoherent or chaotic qualities of noise are at the very center of our quickly evolving dystopia, one in which most of us who are truly good listeners find ourselves. There's the incessant and destabilizing noise of our media sources. Where do we turn for truth and reassurance? How do we abstract consonants from all of the discordant messages we get? Well, there's visual noise. Watch the complex images on the screens of almost any cable news show, or see the urban light pollution generated by populated regions of the globe from satellite or International Space Station imagery. If you want to know how much noise there is in your world, take your smartphone outside and try to record an American robin, the most common American bird with a bright orange breast and present throughout most of the year in most U.S. locations. When you play back your recording, note how many other sounds are present. And if you just want to hear the robin, then all the other sounds constitute noise. And there is a new source of noise to be aware of, the Long-Range Acoustic Device, or LRAD, a diabolical piece of gear used by the military and now local police forces to control crowds. I had an early beta version of this device to test, and trust me, even in human-friendly configurations like I had, you don't want to be at the receiving end of this acoustically focused technology. It's the kind of noise you never want to hear. It hurts, and the damage can be permanent. Yet there are other stories to keep in mind. Those who have lost their hearing as a result of attending the George Floyd civil rights marches recently are all eager to tell their unfortunate stories. The loudest sound ever produced on Earth was not generated by the Who, 125 dB, or Motorhead, 137.5 dB. It was an Indonesian volcano that lost its cool in 1883. Located on an island in the Krakatoa archipelago, the Krakatoa's sound pressure level was estimated at 180 dB, just 14 dB short of the loudest physically possible sound in the Earth's atmosphere. It was a geophonic blast so loud that depending on which historical account you read, it ruptured the eardrums of people 40 miles away, traveled around the world through the atmosphere 4 times as a physically sensed infrasound jolt, and was clearly heard 3,000 miles from the source. Humans have yet to reproduce the extraordinary level of that detonation. By the way, the loudest sustained sound on Earth's surface cannot possibly exceed 194 dB, which is the point at which the amplitude of the sound wave is so intense that the low-pressure wave component is a perfect vacuum, and where the wave alternates between double the atmospheric pressure and no air at all. No living organism can survive an audio signal that intense. However, the sounds we do create can be troublesome enough. Think for a moment of the loudest sound you've ever heard or the sound that was most disturbing. Noise need not be loud. The noise of a dripping faucet can drive some people nuts. The noise of a two-cycle lawnmower or a leaf blower need not be loud, but it still irritates, even if it's a block away. So does the constant yipping of a neighbor's dog just when you're drifting off to sleep. Or two people having a contentious argument. Oprah Winfrey won't tolerate the signal of anyone chewing gum in her presence. That kind of human response to noise is called misophonia. And oh yes, one other thing. Did you know that certain restaurants are designed to make you uncomfortable through the use of noise? Owners know that when creating a space with hard-surfaced walls and floors, with no tablecloths, carpets, or soft textures to cut down reverberation, then add a sound system, the noise will do three things. Number one, it will attract vulnerable groups of people to the chaos, making them think that noise equals action. Then, number two, it'll make you tired and diminish your ability to taste the food as a direct result of exposure to high noise levels. This setting encourages quick turnover and getting you out the door as quickly as possible. It's a perfect example of gastro-capitalism. This is true for many hot, high-priced restaurants that attract young crowds, with, you guessed it, noise. It's a gimmick, folks. We've all been seduced to noise sources. They almost never fail to capture our attention, distracting us from other more important issues. The main problem with noise is that if it's not totally distracting to some, it masks the informative sound signals we all need to hear. And here's the kicker. If it's too loud and constant, you'll likely become ill from the stress it causes. The World Health Organization's report on sound in the EU even concluded that relentless exposure to some types of anthropophony will eventually cause death in some humans. There's city noise, featuring traffic and construction and the urgency of first responder sirens connoting issues of life and death. There are those who feel the need to be noticed by imposing the fierce output of their 808 subwoofers or straight-piping cycle rigs. To Americans, remember, noise is power. And now, there's the more frequent noise of low-flying military or law enforcement helicopters or fire mitigation aircraft defending our rural areas. Well, what do we do about all this racket? First, we need to identify all of the sources that contribute to our sonic world and separate them into proper categories. We'll do that by what we call ear-cleaning sound walks. Leaving your cell phone at home, take a short walk around the block, and if nothing else, the exercise is good activity. Really concentrate and listen carefully to the different kinds of sounds you hear. Which ones fit into the three categories mentioned earlier? Name them if you can. Write them down in a notebook. No problem if you can't name the different species of birds. Just note the difference between a bird and a mammal. Note the difference between the sound of a car or a bus or a truck. Listen to the different types of aircraft flying overhead. The distinction between a jet and a propeller-driven airplane is pretty dramatic. So is the difference between a jet and a helicopter. Each of these sources will have a different impact on you. Note what they are. What category do ground-level transport signals fit into? What about aircraft? What about the sound of wind in the trees? Why don't human-generated sounds qualify as biophonies, or do they? Do the same qualitative listening in various rooms in your dwelling place. Which rooms seem the quietest and most tranquil? The room that gets the highest rating in that category is the one you'll want to sleep in. In most cases, the more tranquil the space, the easier it is to relax and get a good night's rest. In our otherwise chaotic world, you'll need all the stress-free rest you can get. In the middle of your room, Clap your hands and listen for short amounts of echo or reverberation. If it's like most structures, the room will have parallel walls and ceilings parallel to the floor. To eliminate the reverb, those surfaces need to be broken up and made uneven in relationship to one another. Another way to reduce reverb, drop some carpet on the floor. You can get cheap but really good remnant cuts at most carpet dealers. And if that doesn't quite do it, get some thick curtains for the windows and walls. It makes a big difference to have a space that's really quiet and peaceful. Fabric helps. Then, when there is sound introduced into your private space, at least it'll be a type of your choosing, and hopefully those that are life-affirming for you. Outside is a different animal. Cities tend to be noisy and incoherently disruptive. It's up to you to find places to visit that are quiet. Sometimes parks meet those criteria. Try to find green spaces that meet your need for tranquility by first doing the sound walk mentioned a few minutes ago. What do you hear that makes you feel good? What do you hear that doesn't? What are the actions you're willing and able to take to achieve either result? For my wife and I, we finally had to abandon the city for the middle ground of a rural area, a place with still active dirt roads and accessible green spaces nearby. I guarantee you that the more tranquil you can make your life, the healthier you'll feel. And the ways in which sound is allowed to play a role in this case is absolutely key. In the meantime, what can we learn from other cultures? For example, the Bayaka, a group of pygmies living in the remote Zonga-Songa rainforest of the Central African Republic, have one response. The idea of tranquility is central to their survival because it is such a deeply embedded feature of their lives. The rainforest biome has long been home to this semi-nomadic ensemble that traditionally relied solely on the resources the habitat provided to them, the bushmeat that they hunted for food, and the wild plants that they harvested for additional sustenance and medicines. The forest was there to supply whatever they needed, although the Bayaka lived relatively light on the land. One morning in 1984 in New Jersey, an American musicologist named Louis Sarno happened to be listening to a radio program of Bayaka music. He was so captivated by the beauty of the sound that he sold everything he owned. He bought a one-way ticket to Bangui, and he bought a recorder and some microphones and cut most ties with his birthplace, friends, and family. Once on the ground in his newly adopted country, Sarno traveled for several days until he finally caught up with the tribe, all but hidden in their rainforest home. Of the many remarkable attributes of Sarno's life as a musical anthropologist and field recordist, one in particular made me think long and hard about the connection between the biophonies of the natural world and their restorative properties. In fact, my own experience was only amplified by Louis' narrative. As Sarno told the story, during the late decades of the 20th century, a second wave of colonialism, including large conglomerates from Asia and the EU, began large-scale resource removal from the Bayaka's home territory. With the constant noise of accelerated logging of hardwood forests, extraction of diamonds, oil, and the poaching of ivory from the elephant families of the surrounding jungle, the cash economies imposed on the country's ancient cultures by the mega-corporate world replaced the small-scale, as-needed traditional barter exchanges more familiar to the Bayaka. Drawn into the competitive economic and resource-driven models of the West and Asia, tribal members now had to purchase their meager necessities within the imposed cash systems in order to thrive. To acquire enough hard currency, males in their spare time were enticed into the forest to illegally hunt bushmeat protein for the miners, loggers, and administrative personnel, and elephant ivory for export to black markets such as the U.S. and Asia. Meanwhile, the women were lured into prostitution. The neo-capitalistic trade-offs and intimate contact with the foreigners shredded the fragile social and economic structure of their community and introduced levels of trauma and disease not previously known to the Bayaka. The strain on their culture caused many members to become quite ill or to die, raising the question of how they could mitigate the physical and emotional crises that now confronted them. To manage this dilemma, the Bayaka did what they'd always done when faced with turmoil and illness. They disappeared all at once deep into the forest, sometimes for months on end, in order to separate themselves from the colonial bedlam and to heal in remote locations where their forest was still intact. The shamans, who had retained the ancient knowledge of healing herbs and vegetation and how they affected certain diseases and mental conditions, were still able to ply their magical art and craft. And most important, they understood how to integrate the biophonies and geophonies of the forest as curatives for just about everything else. With the biophonies serving as a natural karaoke orchestra with which they performed, the Bayaka would reinstate their ritual songs and dances, again finding solace in the reanimated spirits that could be found everywhere. After sufficient quiet and healing time, the tribal members would reemerge from the forest, healthy and vibrant, only to engage once again in the downward spiral of civilized contact. During the nearly 35 years that Sarno and I worked together until his recent illness and death, what struck me most of all was the way in which the Bayaka, dependent on their ancient connection to the rainforest, were able to sever their seductive ties to civilization and restore some measure of sanity back into their lives, if only momentarily. Can you imagine a healing sonic environment for yourself? What would that sound like? The Japanese have recently come up with a similar solution. It's called forest bathing, or Shinrin-yoku. It's a quest through time spent in forested habitats for more intimate and spiritual connections to the natural world. A simple nature therapy program introduced in the early 1980s by Yoshifumi Miyazaki, a university professor and co-director of the Center for Environmental Sciences at the University of Chiba in Japan, is a largely passive methodology that I was already familiar with from my own encounters with wildlife in the field. Shinrin-yoku, loosely translated, means taking in the medicine of the forest. This evidence-based wellness practice was a direct response to declining health in the Japanese population at the time. The healing energies of the natural world have been known for millennia. This practice is another simple yet powerful way for us to tap into those healing energies that are readily available to all of us, particularly those related to the sonic properties of natural habitats. Extensive research shows that forest bathing offers relief from anxiety and depression, bestows a deeper sense of mental relaxation, better sleep, and an increased feeling of gratitude for being alive, and delivers an overall sense of well-being. When forest bathing, we walk into designated areas after first being given a set of carefully crafted invitations, ways to slow down and to experience the more than human world through a variety of new techniques and our senses. You don't have to cover much distance, but you do need to find a forest. Miyazaki's writings and the stories of the Bayaka confirmed the efficacy of this practice, a process that had taken me many years to acquire. It helped me give voice to my own experiences. Shinrin-yoku inspires us to make time for leisurely strolls in tranquil wooded areas, the simple idea being that a break from the noise in our technosphere in exchange for a closer relationship to natural world phenomena conveys enormous benefits. Think of this as powering tranquility. It's a contemporary antidote to the distractions brought on by the constant acoustic dissonance emblematic of our presence. The secret here is a proactive connection to the natural world, far away from the noise produced by our economies of endless consumption, resource depletion, and all their soundscape signifiers. And that means rediscovering our links to the life-affirming features of that atavistic world, which in turn means a rewilding of our oral senses. Once we reorient ourselves to the calm states we acquire as a result, we can never look back. In the realm of pure feelings, nothing for me has been more spiritual. Before I reveal some secrets to my life and how it became transformed from a critical case of ADHD to one who is able to navigate with a degree of health not imagined until I was 30, let me convey what I feel is at stake if we fail collectively to heal our sorely abused source of life, this place we call planet Earth. This on a small scale is what will happen in the macro. Elders in the YM tribe tell of a time that they fished all year long at Celilo Falls, a little Native American community west of the Columbia River's midway point. Each season provided lots of fish, including Chinook salmon, bluebacks, steelhead, and coho. When the catch was good, members could harvest a ton of fish a day, soon having enough to supply close and extended family all that was needed for a year with little more than the cost of a couple of balls of twine. In recent history, a major event took place along the Columbia River in the Pacific Northwest. It went totally unnoticed by most of the media, but it profoundly affected those who had lived in the region for thousands of years. On the morning of March 10, 1957, the Army Corps of Engineers ordered the massive steel gates of the newly built Dalles Dam shut tight. This action strangled the natural downstream flow of the river, and as the elders stood on the river bank astonished, a way of life that had sustained them for centuries disappeared in less than a day. It all happened very quickly. 6 hours later and 8 miles upstream, the sacred falls of the YM were completely submerged. That day there wasn't a dry eye on the banks of the Celilo, that tiny village on the river's edge. The elders were not weeping for the loss of salmon. They wept because the river no longer lent its wise voice to the community. The submerged Celilo Falls were dead silent. Members report that with the loss of their natural music, the tribe was plunged into a deeper collective despair than at any time since first contact with the whites. Listen to the sounds around you. What do they convey? If the signals are incoherent and have no real meaning in your short lives, what are you willing to do to change them? Through the lens of soundscape ecology, all of the answers are there. Listening is key. Again, we need to listen up. In order to do that, it's probably a good idea to put a cork in it. People often ask, if I want a quieter, more tranquil life, what can I do? The answer is beyond simple. The path to tranquility lies not in what we do. It's what we choose not to do. The paraphrase of David Bowie's aphorism, "The future belongs to those who can hear it coming," spots a momentary position on our journey through the firmament. Meanwhile, back on Earth, amidst all the noise and fierce ambition, what remains to be heard? The wolf's howl? The blissful voice of 10,000 birds singing up the sun? And where are the frogs and insects that signify a midsummer's night? A whale song in an open ocean? The anxious declaration of an ant? A virus liberating itself from a tiny cell? No, it isn't music, the self-referential echo of our own limitations, that restores us. It's a lone cricket awaiting an answer, and our readiness to overhear the implications. Even with eyes wide open, what is essential must first be heard. Jose Emilio Pacheco is right. Night will never be night without the cricket. Go now. The future is waiting. I think you are ready.
And thank you, Bernie, for that presentation and for writing that book and for being with here this evening.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Actually, I'm happy to be anywhere. Yeah,
Well, you've
so
given us a lot of food for thought. And before we dive into the discussion, I just want to do some quick housekeeping notes. Participants, please feel free to unmute